Wonderful. Thank you, Kaiser, and thank you so much for the invitation. Great opportunity. I'm humbled by the work that all of you are doing. I think it's such important work on the ground. I try to do as much within communities as possible. As an academic, I consider myself sort of a public criminologist, and so I recognize how labor intensive, but also how rewarding it is to work on community engagement. So again, I really appreciate that. Estelle, I was interested to hear your engagement with UNESCO. We actually just learned, or just sort of inked the agreement on UNESCO chair in hate studies for us at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. So really excited about that opportunity to enhance our outreach with the Global South in particular and expand our networks across the world, in fact. Okay, so I'm just going to go and excuse me, share my slides again. All right, we've got this down to a fine art by now, I think, how to work with Zoom. Yeah, so I'm gonna set my own timer here. Just give me a second because I do have a tendency to ramble, so I'm gonna try and keep myself on time here.
So Perry, yeah. While you're doing that, can I ask you a question? Are you be able to share your slide deck with us so that our note taker Kristen doesn't have to madly take all the notes? Can we get your slide deck?
Oh, of course, yes, absolutely. Great. I should have sent that to you beforehand.
Yeah. Relax, Kristen.
Absolutely happy to do that. Yeah, so I've been sort of working in this space. Well, I've been working in the space of hate studies broadly for most of my career, so going on 30 years now. But the piece on right-wing extremism, I did a little bit of work in this space, looking at sort of white supremacists specifically when I was still working at Northern Arizona University I guess that would have been sometime in the late 90s, probably. I was looking at it there, and then put it aside because it was just too much to deal with. It was really quite horrifying. At that time there were, you could almost count the number of websites and other sort of online venues associated with the far right, almost, on 2 hands and 2 feet. But what was there was absolutely horrific because there were no filters, there was no moderation, no content moderation whatsoever. So it was really vile. So I put that aside for a while. And about, I guess 8 years ago or so, we got our first grant to look at right-wing extremism in the Canadian context. And so that was really the first comprehensive academic study in this space in Canada. So what I'll present to you today is, some of it comes out of that was published in 2015, but also our more recent observations in the context of a second study in this space. And I think, for those of us, and I'm sure you're among us, excuse me, who follow the news very closely, it's apparent, I think, that there has been a dramatic shift quantitatively and qualitatively in the movement in the last, even just in the last 4 or 5 years. So really, that's what I want to highlight, are some of the flashpoints, if you will, some of the current dynamics and some of the emerging trends that we're seeing as well. Just to put it in context, I want you to think about the kinds of processes and trends and activities that we've seen in recent years that have really galvanized and mobilized the far right in the Canadian context to some extent. We talk a lot about the Trump effect in terms of the extent to which Trump's narratives in both election campaigns and during his administration, his 4-year administration, have vilified a whole array of communities, but also the way in which he really enabled and ennobled, in some respects, far-right actors in that country. And that really did filter up into the Canadian context as well. So that, because of his sorts of narratives, but also because of the Canadian movement's engagement with the American movement, they were also sort of influenced by that as well. So it's a really important piece, I think, of the equation in explaining why we've seen such a surge in the movement over the past few years. Other things that we've seen over the past few years, this is probably, you know, more in 2017, 2018, was the refugee crisis. And I put it in quotation marks because, I mean, sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a crisis for the refugees, the fact that they had to, you know, flee their country, regardless of where we're, you know, where we're talking about, you know, they were at risk in some ways. And even those who came to Canada, tried to cross over into Canada after the Trump election, felt themselves at risk. So it was a crisis in that respect. But the way that the far right framed it was that it was a crisis for Canada, in that it would no doubt, and they were particularly worried about well, this was not the case. They were particularly worried about the fact that, you know, refugees were, you know, sort of were Muslims. That's who they were really worried about. But again, particularly after the Trump election, that was actually a small proportion of the population. Never mind the fact that they don't represent a threat, but they really did represent it as a threat to physical safety, to cultural integrity, to political order, a whole array of issues. So that galvanized the movement. Then more recently, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a lot of activism on the part of BIPOC people generally, Black Lives Matter movement, and various forms of Indigenous resistance, especially in the Canadian context. And so there's some backlash against that amongst the far right. So for example, we saw efforts to disrupt some of the rallies and demonstrations, the BLM demonstrations in particular, by the far right. You know, to disrupt it, but also to engage in violence in a way that brought disrepute to the BLM demonstrations. So you know, that became a you know, important focus and important activity for the far right. Then, of course, we come into COVID, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But it certainly provided a boom for the far right in terms of the exploitation of fear and anxiety, the exploitation of conspiracy theories and disinformation that was swirling around the pandemic, its origins, the safety of the vaccination, a whole array of responses to mandates, all of those pieces that obviously we saw also sort of culminate in the convoys just a month or so ago. And so these are all pieces of the puzzle that help us to understand why it is that we're seeing such a dramatic growth in the far right. I also argue that what we're seeing is a normalizing of hate. Sort of that movement of incivility from the extreme to the mainstream, and again, you know, some of that comes back to Trump and to, you know, his as I said, vilification, both in discourse and narratives, but also in policy, in terms of introducing policies that were intended to marginalize the communities that he was so afraid of. If that's the case. But not to say that it was Trump alone. I mean, we've had our own problems in terms of political narratives around inclusion, diversity during the last Harper administration. I think, you know, we saw I think considerable, considerably more anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim narratives than I think we'd ever seen at the federal level prior to that. So his references to the niqab as being offensive, his reference to Islamization as the greatest threat to Canada, those sorts of things. Kelly Leitch, of course, introducing the notion of screening for Canadian values. At the same time, you know, we had that narrative around the hotline for reporting barbaric cultural practices. And, you know, I think we all know what that thinly veiled language was referring to. Then we have Legault, the premier of Quebec, just a couple of years ago, on the second anniversary, I believe it was, of the shooting, the murders of the Muslim men outside of Quebec City in the Mosque of Saint Foy. And in that context, he could say, "I don't think there is Islamophobia in Quebec, so I don't see why there would be a day dedicated to Islamophobia." So that denial also enables, right, allows for Islamophobia specifically to circulate. Sloan, you'll remember, this was just a year or so ago, was finally ousted from the Conservative caucus because, I mean, there were, you know, a number of damaging and dangerous proclamations that that he offered. One of the sort of last straws was when he claimed that banning conversion therapy would legalize child abuse. So referencing, again, a thinly veiled reference to the stereotype, the negative imagery of pedophilia among LGBTQ community, gay male community in particular. And then more recently, parroting almost word for word Trump's references or Trump's comments in the context of Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally. Bergen said of the convoys that there are good people on both sides. I'm not convinced that she didn't recognize the extent to which that really was, you know, verbatim borrowed from Trump. We've seen other elements of, you know, sort of far-right politics coming into big P politics, if you will. So you see here Faith Goldy, who at the time, this was what, the last, I think, municipal election, or mayoral election in Toronto, ran for mayor. At the time, she was the, no pun intended, but she was the golden child of the far right. She was a very prominent spokesperson for the movement in the Canadian context. And she managed to garner over 20,000 votes in Toronto on an explicitly far-right, racist, Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant platform. Altogether during that election, there were over 40,000 votes garnered by people running on similar platforms, very explicit. And then we see the People's Party of Canada come to the fore prior to not the last election, but the election previous to that. And it was, especially early on, it was a real magnet for far-right actors in Canada. Bernier did not do very much to distance himself from those. And again, Bernier found himself sort of a de facto leader, or maybe created himself as a de facto leader of the anti-vax movement just over the last year or so. And looking at the last federal election, the first election, they garnered very few votes. This last election, well over 800,000 votes nationally. So that in and of itself, I think, suggests a bit of a sea change. Need to think about, I mean, I've talked about normalization, right? But, you know, what's the relevance of that political rhetoric? Well, it does seem to be trickling down to public opinion, public attitudes. So this is just a sampling of some recent public opinion polls. And this is sort of what I'm getting at. These, you know, these first couple in particular, where 33% of those polled in one survey feel freer to publicly express views of other races and ethnicities. 25 and 15% respectively feel that prejudice against Muslims and Jewish community has become more acceptable since 2014. So that is a recognition, I think, amongst the broader public that it is much more acceptable, as it suggests here. It is much more palatable for people to express these sorts of sentiments as well. And we see that, you know, we see that those sentiments are there. So there's worry in terms of how they then express themselves in more physical terms, or even in terms of sympathy, if not adherence to the far right. And I think the most worrying is probably the last one, where 37% felt that immigration was a threat to white Canadians specifically. So really plays to that far right narrative of you know, the immigrant threat. Just a little more context here to think about, not just the far right, but hate crime more broadly. So just last week or the week before, the full report on police reported hate crimes in Canada was released. And we see here since 2016 dramatic increases. So relatively flat from the beginning, the origins of reporting, 2009 to 2016. Then in 2016, we saw a 47% increase. And of course, that corresponds with the first year of the Trump administration. Coincidence? I don't think so. So really dramatic uptick there. Really unusual to see that kind of jump in any category of crime. Bit of a decrease the following year, bit of an increase the next year. And then for the most recent year available, 2020, here we see another 37% increase. So bringing hate crime, reported hate crime, to its highest level historically in the Canadian context. And again, this is a response to those same sorts of patterns that I was describing. I think it's also important to know, where we're seeing these incidents. Now, some of it has to do with, with population, obviously, because these are absolute numbers, not rates. But nonetheless, we do see a clustering in Quebec, Quebec, Ontario, BC, and Alberta. And that corresponds actually to the distribution of activism amongst the far right. So those are the same sorts of provinces where we see more group activity, as well as more individual activity, as far as we can measure it, through online participation specifically. Just to give a sense, again, and thinking back to what some of those flashpoints were, what some of those motivators were, hate crime data also reflect that in terms of the motivation, in that race, ethnicity, and religion tend to be, across year to year, tend to be the most common categories of crime. And again, thinking about what I said, the backlash against BLM and Indigenous activism. So for 2020, you see the really dramatic increase there, almost a doubling in violence against racialized communities. So again, I think a reflection of those same patterns. Sort of moving up the spectrum from hate crime broadly to violence associated with the far right. So in our first study, we identified between 1980 and approximately 2015, 2014, over 120 incidents of violence associated with the far right in Canada. And that ranged from, assaults to arsons, all the way up to homicides. And just to put that in context, during the same period of time, we were able to identify about 8 incidents of Islamist-inspired violence in the Canadian context. So, a real imbalance there that is not necessarily reflected in, sort of popular narratives about the terrorist threat or the extremist threat, or even in, official narratives about where the threat is coming from. Another indicator of that are the number of homicides that we've seen over the past, what is this now, 8 years or so. And this is what I've got here is just in terms of mass murders. So this first one was in Moncton, New Brunswick, where you might remember 3 RCMP officers were essentially ambushed, tracked down, and killed by someone harboring far-right anti-statist, anti-authority views. In particular, the Quebec City mosque murders, 6 Muslim men killed by a young man who was very much a fan of Trump, very active in, or at least a very active consumer of online narratives associated with the far right, so Islamophobic, anti-immigrant in particular. And then, of course, in 2018, we had the 10 people. Actually, an 11th person has died just about 2 months ago of their injuries. They remained in hospital since 2018 and finally did succumb to the injury. So that's actually 11 murders there. So that was, excuse me, the van attack, which was inspired by incel ideology. Excuse me. And then more recently here in London, Ontario, 4 family members killed again in a vehicular attack, a young man, again, very much attached to the far right movement. So sorry. I've got the wood stove going and I think it's drying me out. So what does the far right movement look like in the Canadian context? Well, when we finished that 2015 study, this is really what we were focusing on. This is what we were seeing, to be honest, sort of the very traditional neo-Nazis, skinheads, white supremacists. So, when you sort of close your eyes and think about, what is someone from the extreme right, who is that? I think you generally think about these, the black clad neo-Nazis, the very aggressive stance, the very angry stance, which is grounded largely in, if we're talking about neo-Nazis and skinheads, obviously in glorification of Nazi ideals derived from the Second World War. And to some extent, we were already starting to see a real sort of independent anti-Muslim movement that shared some of the white supremacist ideals, but was really primarily focused on the Muslim threat as they understood it, and also to some extent anti-immigrant threat, again, sort of aligning the two as if they were inseparable. And certainly we've come to see a much more explicit anti-Muslim pillar of the movement. More recently, we're hearing a lot about the accelerationists here. So the base, Atomwaffen division, some are calling, the Diagolon movement that we heard so much about during the convoys, an accelerationist movement. And it is what it says on the tin, right? Their intent is to accelerate or to provoke an all-out civil war. And so if you think about the events of January 6th in the US, that was really celebrated by American and Canadian activists as the beginning of that civil war, at least for the US. You'll remember too, perhaps, that as the convoy was making its way across the country, that there were folks calling for the convoy and the ultimate occupation of Ottawa to be our January 6th. So again, the start of our civil war, with not necessarily any plans for what the alternative might be, what's the end game of that civil war. It's really just to be disruptive for many of them. The alt-right as well is, it's interesting because often people use this term alt-right as an umbrella term for the contemporary far-right movement. The alt-right is actually a very explicit, specific part of the movement that rejects traditional conservative politics, arguing that they have not gone nearly far enough, but also rejecting, sort of the more in-your-face and aggressive forms of white supremacy or forms of nationalism associated with, the skinheads or the neo-Nazis, for example. So, that very preppy professional look, that representation of self that is, much more palatable and sanitized, if you will, right? The Izod t-shirts as opposed to the black jackets or even the, the white hoods. And it's interesting how it corresponds to David Duke, who was the Grand Wizard of the KKK in the 80s, saying, throw off those white hoods and put on your business suit. So it's sort of the contemporary version of that, if you will. We also include here the manosphere, or that element of the movement that is explicitly concerned with misogyny. So in particular, I mean, resentment, if we're talking about incel, right, the involuntarily celibate, hostility towards women generally, because women won't have anything to do with them, but even more broadly than that, they're anti-feminist. They're very resistant to the to women's rights and sort of the successes that women have experienced, because they see that as a threat to their position, men's position and dominance. And then we have the patriots and militia movements. So 3%ers, for example, that were also apparent during the convoys. And these tend to be the most aggressive. And I'll talk a little bit more about them later on. And then we have the conspiracy theorists and anti-authority movement. I see I've got these in italics because these are elements that sort of cross the spectrum from left to right. But there's something very specific to the far right conspiracy theorists or the far right anti-authority activists, for example. And then we have lone actors and ideologues, and the lone actors were some of those mass murders I was just referring to, were people who are connected to the movement, maybe not actively engaged, but certainly consuming and informed by the movement, but act out on those sentiments individually and without support. I talked about the distribution across the country, and you can see that again here. Not much has changed in terms of those concentrations and those pockets, although we're seeing a little bit more activity down east than we did the first time around. So this is from the 2015 map. We're just in the process of updating and creating the map for the current study, but it won't really change very much in terms of distribution, although the numbers have increased quite dramatically. And so what we're seeing is, yeah, quite a growth in numbers. And that includes new groups and new chapters of existing groups. So at the end of 2015, we identified about 100 active far-right groups in the Canadian context. And now over the last couple of years, we've identified over 300 active groups, many of them online, almost primarily, if not totally online, but nonetheless, their narratives continue to be dangerous. We're also seeing, though, like some of those lone actors that we referred to, sort of an atomization of the movement. That is, a lot more people who are being drawn to the movement without necessarily affiliating with a particular group. So they are, consuming narratives from this group, that group, the other group. They're on from their online platforms. So sort of cherry picking, conspiracy theories or disinformation that suits their needs or their uses, provides the answers that they're looking for. So growth in numbers in terms of groups, but also dramatic growth in the number of individuals drawn to the movement. Oh boy, I'm not going to get very far. So we're also seeing a demographic shift. So again, I think as we saw with the far right actors who are involved with the convoy, right? It's an older demographic, typically well employed. We think about the skinheads and the Nazis as disenfranchised youth. That's no longer only the case, right? We've still got those elements, but there are more middle-aged and older people being drawn to the movement, especially in the context, I think, of COVID and the threats to employment, the threats to wages, the threats to small businesses that are posed, have been posed there. We're seeing more coalition building, and we certainly saw that in the events of January 6th, as well as the convoys. So in that first study, there was a lot of infighting within groups, across groups. Now we're seeing much greater efforts to strategically work together towards the same goal, towards the same ends. With the convoys, to end the mandates, perhaps to overturn the government, whatever their intent might be. One of the most dangerous trends I think we're seeing is this tendency to be armed and dangerous. So we're seeing more of a guns rights narratives in the Canadian context that was has really not been a part of the far right to any great extent. So people are arming themselves. They're glorifying the use of heavy weapons. So you see images of the 3%ers, for example, engaged in paramilitary training out in the woods with stockpiles of guns on tables. You'll remember the images from Coots during the convoy, right, where Diagolon and other groups, it appeared, had come together, also armed and ready for action. And the other piece is the training. So we're also seeing quite a significant nexus with the military, between the far right and the military. And again, something we saw on January 6th, a fairly large proportion of people involved in those events were former or current military or law enforcement. And we're beginning to see signs that may also have been the case with the convoys as well. And so I think over the next few months, we'll hear more about that. But there is also a real concerted effort to recruit from the military, because there's this sense that they can bring leadership and training to the movement that can then be exploited. We do know that LeMut, for example, which is a Quebec-based group, was founded by 2 former military personnel. You see some high-profile cases here. There are many more than that. We've just completed a paper where we had, oh gosh, it was 30 or 40, I think, at least, that were readily identifiable just from open source. And yes, we are working with DND right now to do a deeper dive in this particular area. I think I'm just gonna, I'll call it, maybe I'll just come back to this little piece here in terms of the impact of COVID and how that has allowed the circulation, the whole array of conspiracy theories that have also some of them long informed the far right, but have been sort of re-embraced by the far right. So that, you know, blaming of the anti-Semitism in particular, the blaming of Jews for the virus, you know, fear that there's, you know, that there are implants in the vaccine so that, you know, Jews can control the world, just a whole array of very bizarre conspiracy theories. And we also, of course, saw some of the similar parallel theories, conspiracy theories around Asia, around China and Asian communities more broadly. And you can see here, this was fairly early on, was the ethno-nationalists. So many of the groups that we're talking about here were the most active in terms of their conversations around COVID-19, again, hosting many of those conspiracy theories. So yeah, just I guess to close is, you know, this question of how we respond to hate, and I think that the initiative that that the team here is developing is an important part of that in terms of the research and the public forums, obviously, in terms of enhancing critical digital literacy, countering online hate. But I think we also need to bring pressure to bear on our political leadership, and in terms of you know, really taking a stand against all these forms of hate, organized hate groups, you know, online hate, you know, the polarization that we're seeing, all of those sorts of pieces, including giving real teeth and resources and infrastructure to support the National Action Plan on racism. And I think, you know, necessary to say, sadly, that we also need to see more effective enforcement of the legislation that we already have before we begin to consider new legislation, which we might also, you know, not enforced effectively. So I think there's lots of work to be done on multiple stages. I like to think about approaches to far-right extremism and hate generally as multi-sectoral. These are not just criminal justice issues. These are not just legal issues. They're public health issues. They're educational issues. They're social service issues. I mean, they really cross virtually every sector of society, not for profit organizations, civil society organizations that many of you represent have just a crucial role to play in this. And I think, you know, that's also where we'll need that political will and political leadership to continue to support the sort of work that you do. So that said, I will shut up for a minute and give you time to digest, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Wow, that is a lot to digest. Really,
that was a lot.
Presentation. I mean, amazing numbers. I'm actually stunned by some of them. I'm going to just turn it over to the floor. If you hit your hand button, raise your hand button if you've got some questions or thoughts. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions.
I'll answer a couple of the questions that were in the chat, because I was moving very quickly, so I didn't explain everything. The numbers on the Canadian map represented the number of active groups at that time, the number of active groups in that province. What wasn't necessarily reflected there are sort of the pan-Canadian groups as well. So those like Pegida is an anti-Muslim group. It's an acronym taken from the German Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West. So they had a national chapter and then multiple provincial chapters as well. So we've counted the provincial groups but the national group wasn't necessarily reflected there. Diagolon, so that was the group that we heard so much about during the convoy. You might remember their emblem, sort of their symbol was, and their, well, I don't think they were very serious about this, but was a map that would be a new ethno-state, white ethno-nationalist state that would form a diagonal from sort of lower mainland BC down to Florida, cross-cutting most of the US. So they're ethno-nationalist group, and so but they're also an accelerationist group, right, where the intent is to disrupt the current order, and again, not necessarily any idea of what that's going to be replaced by. Yes.
Larry, I see a hand.
Thank you very much for that presentation. There's a lot more that we'd like to learn from you, Doctor. My question is, if there is a site besides the ADL site where there might be a list of the hate groups that exist in Canada, and their publications, their leadership, maybe their activities that we might have access to.
We are so far behind our American counterparts in that space. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network has collected some of that. We do have a website on the far right attached to the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. Probably by the end of the summer, we'll be posting exactly that kind of information, the lists of groups, the distribution of the groups, that sort of thing.
And we
really don't have a national entity that monitors the movement in the same way that Southern Poverty Law Center or the Anti-Defamation League are able to do. We just, none of the groups here have those resources.
I have posted the link, what Professor Barbara Perry is now leading Center for Hate, Bias, and Extremism in the chat room. So please do visit, and they do run a number of webinars. I have participated in the past 2, so these are very informative, just for information sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaiser.
In the absence of any hands, I have a question, Dr. Perry. Do you have any, just really quick, 1 or 2, 3 suggestions of what we should focus on as we develop resources for schools? We're still in the early stages of where we want to go with this. We want to create a toolkit for teachers. Can you just tell us the highlights of what we should be focusing on for teachers?
Yeah, I think especially for youth, the thing that always comes to mind is this notion of critical digital literacy, and not just for youth, I should add. Adults are vulnerable and gullible as well. But I think we really need to develop those skills that enable youth not just to do the fact checking. That's only a small part of it, but to really unpack the narratives for themselves, and to also, I think, to learn how to engage in conversations around these issues. So a lot of it, they're introduced to online, but I think increasingly that's also moving, even amongst youth, that's moving offline, where people are even kids are talking about the convoy and the mandates and all of that sort of thing. So how do you, I think those are important skills to develop, is how to have those very difficult conversations, and how to develop sort of an informed approach and sort of set of responses to those questions. But the critical digital literacy, I think, is the most important one. Absolutely. To apply what we think of as critical thinking skills from the broader context specific to those online narratives, because there are just some of the websites, some of the social media platforms are so slick and so good at presentation of self, if you will, that they present their materials in ways that appear very scientific or very professional, but really require a little bit more digging.
Thank you. Hauser and then Bell, and then I think we'll have to wrap after that.
Okay, so Professor Barbara, thank you so much for your lecture. Just a 2-part question here. I'll be very quick. So, Professor, you are looking at extremism amongst the members of the armed forces. I guess it's quite early in your research and also advocacy. So, but what do you see initially? And of course, we have some data, public from the public sources, open sources, that members are actually, many of them were found have some link to extreme groups. So what do you see the trend and pattern? Should we be worried enough in the future? So that is the first part. And second part, if you kindly comment about enforcement, because it is again in a very, I would say, murky space of hate and crime and terrorism. So what do you recommend in terms of enforcement? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Counselor. Yeah, easy questions there. So with respect to the military, I think that one of the most important observations that we're making is in terms of where and when people are and why people are vulnerable to recruitment or to engagement with the right wing. So as I mentioned, some people go into or enlist, especially in the reservists, right? So they're already engaged, they're already radicalized, they're already part of a group, and they go into the reserve to get what they think are the skills that they need. Patrick Matthews is a case in point, right? He was a reservist. In fact, many of those high-profile cases are reservists. So they are already radicalized and they come in, and then of course they radicalize others. So then that's the second point, right? That there are people who become radicalized while they're in service, maybe because they're being recruited, but also perhaps because of combat experience, right? So you go abroad, you're trained to recognize that person, that community as the enemy. You come home, the debriefing is not effective in terms of then sort of helping them walk that back. So they become radicalized because of their experiences. And then the other piece is after they've left the military. So we see a lot of veteran engagement with the movement in part because they're trying to find something that replaces that environment, that camaraderie, that belonging, also that discipline, right? They're also looking for that same sort of structure and in community. And so this is one option that becomes available to them. In terms of enforcement and gaps, oh my gosh, I don't know where to start or begin there. Maybe this is the best place to start, is when we were doing the field work for the first study, much of our work was with law enforcement and intelligence personnel who at that time, so 2012, 2013, 2014, there was real denial of the far right threat. There was a failure to recognize, and that persists in a lot of quarters, right? That this isn't the threat. Those left wingers are the threat, or those brown people are the threat. So there's a real hesitancy to even acknowledge sort of the risks associated with the far right. There's also just a general, I think, challenge and difficulty in thinking about that spectrum, that continuum, right? From hate crime to extremist violence to terrorism, right? Where do some of these incidents lie? And those are political decisions, right? In terms of how we define them. If we think about those cases, those 4 cases of mass murder that I talked about, rarely were they understood as extremism. The exception is the most recent one. And I think it's because it's in the context of broader conversations and broader pressure on the government to acknowledge those sorts of incidents as extremist violence, as what the government is calling ideologically motivated violent extremism.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Who's next, Linda?
Tim,
you're
if you have
muted.
a very short question.
Bill, yeah.
I'll just be very brief, and perhaps we'd have a chance to discuss this later. But first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. And a lot of what you have in there is actually what we are presenting to students, with one additional fact. I don't think Canada has really, and certainly students are not taught very much about what happened in the past, because what we're seeing today is not really unique to the present. We have a past history of fascism, neo-fascism, and recruitment or leadership from the military. I'm thinking of William Whitaker and Adrien Arcand. And I feel that when we show students that this is something that has repeated throughout our history, and what the result is and who the focus is on, they really start to understand what is happening today and have an ability to learn from that past as well as the present, and greater ability to resist this kind of radicalization to the right. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I love that. Absolutely. Yeah. In the report and the subsequent book we did in this space, we actually have a whole chapter devoted to that historical evolution of the movement. You're absolutely right. It's so crucial. I also want to say, interesting, a few years back, I had a class where students were asked to, this was what the course was about, was creating an online, primarily online intervention against right-wing extremism, radicalization to right-wing extremism. But, you know, they could do offline parallels as well. So one group actually created a workshop on right-wing extremism and delivered it to about a dozen grade 10, grade 11 classes in our area. And what was really interesting was they came back and said, you know, we expected this. Oh, well, the students were so surprised. They had no idea. They didn't know what this looked like. They didn't know it was here in Canada. So we expected that. But they also came back and said the teachers said the same thing. And I think that was worrying, right? Because if they're not prepared for those conversations, then where are the youth getting it? So yeah, very, very important what you're doing here. And the work
and that's really going to be the focus of our summer, of one day of our summer institute, the Summer for Teachers, because we do feel that that is an area that is lacking and that they haven't encountered, as you say.
That's great. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Good question, Bill. Tim, a very brief question.
Sure. It relates to what was spoken by Bell and Dr. Perry as well. I think my wonderings about this, the toolkit and the interventions and that type of thing, and what you're mentioning about, university students looking at doing interventions. That's how I actually met Kosser and did some partnering with him when he had his students come to my classroom. But what I'm looking at, I just wrote some notes about the right-wing extremism, and there's all these different variations and renditions of that, and thinking about them as unique discourse communities that have crossover, where they, have elements of their worldviews and practices and processes that sort of overlap and that are also unique and individual. And then I was also thinking, we're hearing a lot about the adult right-wing extremist type of archetype, but I think, and I'm wondering, this is a question out to the academics too, in terms of areas of research. Where are we seeing that manifest for kids mostly? Is it internet? Is it face-to-face, web-based? These type of dimensions, I think, that are going to be the critical elements for us when we move into things like critical digital literacy or discourse theory, deconstructions, and things like that in classroom and whatnot too. What do we know about where these members of these communities exist, how they recruit, how they play out, the subtleties of the nature of their discourses too. I am a little bit worried just with regards to generalist thought about this too, generalizing, overgeneralizing, because there's so many uniquities here too. So
yeah, absolutely unique. I mean, there's not one pathway. There are multiple ways, and it's not a linear process, right? There'll be movement in one direction and then backing off and then movement in another direction as well. But we've been talking more and more about, this process of grooming on online spaces in particular that often migrate to offline spaces. For youth, there aren't that many offline points of engagement. For young adults, yes, the bars, some of those venues have become really important, music concerts, all of that. But for youth, it tends to still be online. And one of the most terrifying areas are the gaming platforms. And the games themselves, some of the games themselves are absolutely horrific. They're misogynistic, they're racist, they're anti-state, a whole array of problems with the games. But it's really the ancillaries that are especially problematic. The chat rooms associated with the games. This is where the grooming happens. Oh, I see you really, you're really focused on killing women in that game. Tell me more about that. And they'll just, befriend them in a very slow, gradual process, and then lead them, into darker and darker spaces. Same thing happens, in music venues. Some of that is also the algorithms, right? You don't have to be groomed by an individual intervening. The algorithms take you into darker and darker spaces as well. So I think those are, for youth in particular, those are probably the two most important areas: the gaming platforms and the music venues. We're actually working with John Howard Society of Ottawa, Boys and Girls Club of Ottawa, and a couple of police services here in Ontario, developing a safe gaming curriculum and a sort of anti-racist, anti-extremist game, video game as well, that takes them through some of those decision trees in terms of being able to recognize when someone's trying to lead them astray.
Thank you.
Oh, you're muted, Linda.
Thank you. If we didn't have enough to worry about, the algorithms are sending these kids down rabbit holes as well.
Yeah.
That really stuns me.
Yeah.
Dr. Perry, that was amazing. And I wish we had more time. We always need more time. Zoom is just not a good way to get together. You're very welcome to hang around for this next portion if you wish. We're inviting our participants to share any initiatives they have that are working against radicalization, from the young to older students. If you'd like to sit in, and if not,
I'll sit in for the first 12 minutes or so, and then I have to go for another meeting. But yeah, I'm happy to hear a few nuggets of wisdom, absolutely, that I can take home.
Great, thank you. So
Thanks
I'm
so